Thank you. Next, we have a panel of new fellows discussing the digital literacy. And moderating this session is Professor Eleanor Huntington. She's the Executive Director, CSIRO, and Visiting Professor at ANU. Joining Professor Huntington are the following panelists, and as I'm reading out their bios, if I can please invite them to come up to the stage. Professor Anne Nicholson, she's a Dean, Faculty of Information Technology at Monash. Professor Nicholson is a computer scientist specializing in artificial intelligence. She's a respected international expert in Bayesian networks, the dominant technology used to support rational decision-making under uncertainty in complex situations. Next, we have Professor Mary Foley. She's a managing director at Telstra Health. And Professor Mary Foley has made an extensive contribution to health systems, leadership, and policy development in Australia. Next, Richard White. Richard is CEO and founder of WiseTech Global. Richard founded WiseTech Global in 1994, growing it to a 19 billion ASX listed company that is a leading global supplier of logistics, execution software, servicing over 18,000 customers across 170 countries. And finally, Professor Michael Milford, Joint Director, QUT Centre for Robotics, ARC Laureate Fellow, and Professor at QUT. Professor Milford is a leading researcher in neuroscience-based robotics navigation. He works closely with industry and government in developing high-performance positioning systems for robotics and autonomous vehicles. Please join with me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much, Veena. Hello everyone. My name is Eleanor Huntington, and as Veena said, I'm the moderator for this panel. I will start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we gather today and pay my respects to elders past and present. And it is my very great pleasure to moderate what I think is going to be an animated and potentially quite divergent conversation today. We've been having some discussions in the lead up to this panel, and I think it's fair to say that we all have opinions with a capital O. So we're going to structure this discussion in three phases. The first is, the general topic is digital literacy. We're going to start off with having a quick discussion about what we mean by digital literacy. Then we're going to move on to societal and industrial pull around what that might look like, and then move on to interventions. So we will kick off with that very first phase. And I'm going to go to Anne because she's been doing her homework like a good dean of a faculty of IT should do. Can you start with your definition of what we mean by digital literacy, Anne?
Yeah, thank you. So my homework identified that there isn't a shared understanding yet about what this means. And that's not really surprising given that we're a relatively young discipline and a very fast-moving discipline. I did find out that the Australian National Curriculum for the start to year 10 has actually, of the 7 fundamental areas, changed from being ICT capability to digital literacy by being one of those 7. So I think that idea of moving from capabilities and possibly around skills to a broader understanding of a digital literacy, analogous in some ways to ordinary literacy, is interesting. But in that description, it's really around a combination of knowledge, skills, and behaviours, and what people need to do to live, learn, and work in society when we're in the 21st century, and really access to information, but more than information, access to services and to be participants in societies increasingly through these digital technologies. So there's a need for that. Now, what those knowledge and skills are, I won't go into huge detail, but I guess, and that's not going to surprise you, Dean of a Faculty of IT, is I think that there needs to be some understanding of the basics of what hardware and software is, and how it's, especially software, how it's created. And I don't just mean coding. I think the idea you can just do a coding course and then you've got digital literacy nailed is not it. but understanding how it's created and hence what it might mean and how you use it with that understanding of the fundamentals. And data is a large part of that in all the definitions that I saw. It's how it's stored, managed, transmitted, secured. We all know about that. And if people don't understand that basics, they can't then bring into that context of use and ethical understanding, either in work or their rights and responsibilities as citizens around that as well. So I do think that understanding of where it comes from, not this magic device that just does stuff. And so I think really moving beyond it just being comfortable using technology, it's more than that. It has to be underpinned by that understanding. And I wanted to call out that it's not just about putting in the curriculum, it's around our society having digital literacy, because what means to be digitally literate is going to change as the technology changes. So it's not like, you learn to read and write at some level at school and that's your foundation forever. I think it's going to change as well. So that's a little bit, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anne. And that calling out the three things of knowledge, skills and behaviours is like helpful, and hopefully we will not be too much into we've got a row of panellists glaring at us here saying please don't step into the skills space too much. Before we move on, Michael made me promise that I wouldn't ask him to define AI, but do you have any particular issues, ideas that you'd like to contribute around ideas around what digital literacy means?
I guess to pick one topic where I think digital literacy is very relevant. Most people aren't very aware of it, but arguably the largest advance in artificial intelligence technologies and capabilities has become mainstream literally just this year and hit the public conscious in the last few months. If you are an active member of society, whether you're working, whether you're just participating in any sort of aspects of society, and you write or create or do anything that generates an output, there is and you've heard this story before, but this time it's real, there's a very real chance that you'll be doing this increasingly in a highly collaborative manner with much more sophisticated automation and artificial intelligence related technologies. And so a key, I guess, overarching essence of digital literacy in this new age will be, are all members of society able to effectively and intuitively understand the nature of these new technologies, and it is a fast-moving target, and are they going to be able to prosper and flourish in this situation where you are increasingly interacting with these technologies? It's not just looking up a piece of information in a database, it's collaboratively searching for something, finding a record with very sophisticated technologies like AI, and that's going to be critical to everyone's prosperity moving into the future.
Thanks, Michael. We might move now onto some of the discussion around societal and industry needs and pull. So I'll kick off with you, Richard. Despite the long-term focus on STEM education and particularly women's participation in STEM, things don't seem to be moving along as quickly as we would like. What's your take on what's going on?
Well, I definitely think that we are stuck in some of a problem. And I think, look, everybody in this room could claim to be strongly educated and have passed the boundary of what we're trying to solve here. But we are dealing with a problem that there's a small percentage of society that gets this done very well, and a large, particularly in the teen years, of people that are getting distracted or ejected or really just disengaged from learning. And some of this is, I blame Facebook and Instagram in some ways for the modern generation, but that wasn't around when I was in school, and certainly the same things I saw were there, the same effects were there. We've got a problem in the education system that isn't in the last decade, it isn't in the last 50 years, it's been around for a very long time. The difference is that our demand for those that are able to create these skills, these abilities really, is much, much higher, and it has a much more significant implication for our society and for our economy. So not only is the need much greater, but the effect that we're trying to create is much more important. But the results that we've got are either stagnant or actually declining. And interestingly, and I'm very strongly of the view that we're talking the right talk and we're saying the right things here, and in the publication that's just been released, very important concepts are there. But the interesting thing is, we're not actually talking about the effect we want to create. We're talking about the mechanism to create that effect. Now, as a business, I run the whole of WiseTech on done statements. I start with what the end looks like and then work backwards. And a lot of the time, we actually rebuild an entire environment completely differently because we've realised that the old environment was never going to get us to the done statement or the effect we were trying to create. Our education system has been around for a long time. It's pretty hardened, and it's hard to change. And there's good reasons for that, but there's also bad reasons for that. Ultimately, we're in a local optima. We're trying to fix something which is very functional, but not delivering the things that we're talking about. Not delivering the future. It's delivering a lot of things, but it's not delivering any more. And particularly in mathematics, and I think also in science, the results are falling at least in high schools. And despite all the money that's been put in since Gonski, and there's been a very significant step up in monies, it hasn't actually changed the result. It's actually weakened. The result has slightly weakened, if anything. So there's something wrong here that we're not seeing. Something that's not just about principles. It's about fundamental a systems thinking approach. As an engineer, a systems thinking approach is needed to fix this problem.
Thanks, Richard. Do any of our colleagues from the university system or educators want to jump in on that one, or?
I do.
Go for it.
I certainly agree that, I mean, coming through as a woman who did computer science at university in the 80s, when I was a minority, maybe 10%, and then starting off as an academic 10 years later and looking and it wasn't much better. I can't believe that now in the 2020s, we're still looking, especially in the more technical ends of certainly my discipline, but I think in STEM in general, that we're still looking at such fundamentally below gender parity in terms of women's participation and engagement. So I agree that what we've been trying to do, while well-meaning, some of it well-resourced, some not, isn't actually shifting the dial. I think if we keep the pace we're going now, it'll take us another 100 years to get to where we want to be. So we can't really dismantle and re-engineer the whole education system.
No.
We've got what we've got. It's around people and teachers and buildings and systems. But I do think that we're starting to understand that putting groups of people, and that can be at the school level, at university, in a room to sit and be given the same information at the same time and expected to learn at the same rates and being very passive except for when there's some particular activity that you have to do is not the way to get people engaged and actually learning at that higher levels and engaged in these really complex problem-solving ways of thinking that we want to get people into STEM. And I think that we know pockets of how to do it. It's like, don't progress people just by age. Let them learn in different groups when they're better at maths and not so good at English. And I'm speaking as a parent of kids who've gone through the system. And then at university, we are we have to manage to do it at scale. And I think that Australia's mass higher education system has been very successful in, creating a great sector and generating both income for the country, but large pools of graduates. It's really hard to do that at scale and be flexible around individual learning. But we have to look at the individuals, we have to look at interdisciplinary, we have to break down boundaries of disciplines within the way we teach and the way we group students. And I think that we can do that within the structures we've got if we have the will to, and we're willing to put in the resources on supporting the change, not just getting more students in and through.
So bear with me, team here, and feel free to go into thoughtful silence if I've gone too far left of where we were planning on going. Just to pick up on Anne's point in terms of the definition of literacy, which is as much around behaviours as skills and knowledge. I had a mind-blowing moment about 3 years ago when I discovered that one way of understanding the way that we understand the schooling system these days is that a mass state-sponsored primary and high school was invented at around about the same time as the Industrial Revolution was taking off, and in fact one of its primary purposes was to acculturate people to that way of working, which is around behaviours and culture. Does anyone want to come with me on that one around digital literacy and where we might go in the future?
I'd just like to add a little bit as well. So we're competing against massively distracting technology platforms like Facebook and Instagram and many others. And they employ rooms full of organisational and behavioural psychologists to make it incredibly attractive and very distracting to the world. And yet our education system has none of that. And the fundamental, you're right, a lot of what we're doing today is hundreds of years old, 100 years old at least.
About 150 years old.
Yeah, 150 years. So we do need to look at that and understand that, but we're actually competing against it for attention. And a lot of us have learned to switch off those distracting things and to focus. A lot of us have developed enormous curiosity so that we love to learn about all sorts of things, but that's not how children are being taught. They're being taught about that TikTok is 90% of their lives, and you're not going to get maths and science in that 10% that's left. So there's a very fundamental social problem here, and there is a very fundamental social problem about engaging young women in education, particularly in technical education, because they're not encouraged to do that. The society says girls do this and boys do that, and they say it in hundreds of subtle ways in the school grounds, with parents and grandparents when they're walking around society. These are fundamentally deep problems, and they're all behavioural problems. They're all behavioural.
Can
Mary,
I
go
come
for
in
it.
there
Yeah.
perhaps, and having been responsible for a digital health company over the last 5 years, and then before that very much involved in healthcare delivery and policy at both state and federal levels, public sector and private sector, just so you know where I'm coming from on this. I've given my background focus on the other end, and there's a whole lot of things around education, how we educate. Yes, if you opened up any volume of Dickens and went to a classroom scene in David Copperfield, it's more recognisable than not to what we have now. It's only superficially changed, and so that's a very confronting issue. But if you go the other way, and if I draw on my experience, I'm a member of Chief Executive Women and was from I'm not one of its illustrious founders, but I was probably the next 10 years later generation in joining that. The same thing was said about women in business and women on boards, women in senior executive roles of corporations and so on. And it was always, the pipeline's too small, girls aren't doing it, they're told to do teaching and nursing, not to take anything away from those two very important professions. And so it just takes time, and we've got to get the pipeline right. And there isn't, and also from all the men that were doing the appointing, by definition, the women aren't there yet. And I think that's been shown to be a complete furphy. And if you come back to the workplace, that what you aspire to and want to do, and what you might even see on TikTok or Facebook or something, is you can't, that mantra, you can't be what you can't see. And there's plenty of evidence, demonstrated evidence, that addressing that unconscious bias, which Richard, you just described, I helped my daughter with her two little children who are learning to swim, one's 6 months and the other's 2.5. And Lucy the 2.5-year-old wanted to go bowling into the men's room, and I had to say, "Oh, you can't go in there, darling." And I thought, how do I explain this? Because I'm really saying you're a girl and boys are different, and only boys can go in there. And I thought, wow, it is so fundamental. But if you do things in the workplace that actually you actually proactively identify the women who have made choices like you did, Anne, and then actively go and find them and actively appoint them into these key roles, the thing starts to change. There's a tipping point. You all know one token woman is really tough going. I've been that in my time in the 80s and 90s. 2 helps, you've got a friend, and I've been there as well. It's still a boys' club. But it's when you start to get a volume there, then people start to see it, and then that starts to draw people through to say, well, maybe I don't want to be some of the traditional professions like a lawyer or a doctor or a policeman or something that people see every day and know what that is, and has been around as professions for a long time, can say, oh, I want to be one of those, and not only that, but I can see someone like me doing that, whether that's a gender issue or other diversity issues. And I think there's and if you do that, you suddenly demonstrate that there are women there, and that's what, going back to Chief Executive Women, when it was founded, it really challenged that myth and said, no, there's plenty of women, here they are. We've got them as our members, we sort of promote information about this, but it looks different and feels different when the environment has been very male.
Just to echo the comments about children, so we started, my business started off 2 decades ago just doing conventional textbooks for adults. And then it was just incredibly frustrating because by that stage we'd already lost most of the critical battles, and we could turn around some people, but it was pretty much a lost cause. So then we worked our way downwards through high school and then into primary school. And then we eventually ended up, which is where we do most of our work now, in preschool areas. And there's a colleague here who actually has a series of educational things for babies. It's like quantum physics for babies. And we do sort of the 2-year-old to 6-year-old market. And it seems like a lot of the critical battles, and there's lots of evidence that shows that a lot of the diversity issues come to a head from ages, I think, 6 to 8, right? And so it seems like, relatively speaking, we should also be investing a lot more effort and resources early on, because it just gets progressively harder the later you leave it.
And by the way, I'm not saying that we should stand stagnant on the fact that there's no supply. In fact, WiseTech is reaching very deeply into the education system to do the reverse of that, to try to encourage people at a very early age, as you're doing. The problem is we've got to do that. And we actually have an analogue education system teaching a digital skill set. We are not digitised enough in the education system at all.
Okay, let's leave the education system there. Let's move on to the other end. So Mary, talk to us a little bit about how you think digital literacy is going to play out in the health and care sectors.
Well, look, it's absolutely critical, and I think picks up on many of the themes that Anne identified in the definition of digital literacy, but gives it a whole dimension that people don't first think of when they think about what digital literacy is. And healthcare sector, or if you add health and human services and bring in aged care and some other things, well, health just alone, delivery of health services is OECD average 10% of GDP, and it's 10% of GDP here. A mix of public, private, all kinds of providers, very constructive ways of funding and other regulatory environments that it operates in. It's full of a whole it's one of the biggest employment sectors, and one of those few employment sectors that is even with AI expected to grow. And we all know, everyone in it and anybody looking at it, that it's going to radically transform with digital technologies. It's had plenty of technology, that's why modern medicine is as wonderful as it is, and that we're all living into our 80s and 90s now is a big part of that is the new technologies in healthcare. And so health's very literate in those, but digitally literate and how you can actually run your day-to-day world of work and what you do and how you deliver your outcomes is fundamentally changed by digital. And not only that, it's going to be one of the important pieces that continues to ensure healthcare is affordable, accessible, of good quality, and that is able to, our introductory talk, able to embrace precision medicine, but also ways to organise care, removing the variation, removing the waste, having better supporting tools, and even looking at the challenges of workforce numbers and how the workforce is organised. How do you get there? Everybody can see it, but how you actually navigate there is challenging, and some of the big tech players have all had their health divisions and lobbed things into healthcare, and as I say, they spit them back because they're just not gelling that, and because of the environment has its own things that the software does need to fit into. I'm all for some disruption, but I'm actually, I think in this space, more about not disrupting, but how you get people to embrace. So the digital literacy challenge in healthcare is both for all the staff, and they're many of them highly educated people, some of the most highly educated people, delivering huge volumes of services every day, how they think digital, which can change your model of care. that can embrace digital technologies even long before we get to AI or indeed precision medicine and genomics, just how you can actually wire up a system and who does what and how it's done. And to be able to think that way if you're responsible for healthcare delivery, to think you know how to build a hospital or a clinic and what equipment you put in it and how you staff it, to also think about how you did, the same considerations in planning and delivering that service, that you have enough knowledge and understanding of what digital is, and it's got nothing to do with coding in this context. You've got specialists who do that. It's about thinking about how you can use these tools to provide the service and provide a better service. And an affordable service, and one that knits together key pieces of information and so on around a patient that normally sit in disconnected silos. And anybody who's navigated healthcare for any serious or chronic illness will know that it's the patient and their families who provide the glue that bring all that together. Whereas in the future, the system will be able to do that supported digitally. So how you educate and bring the staff to be able to think that way. And then, of course, the patient also, which goes to everybody, has to be able to have a basic level of being comfortable navigating something like this. How I use this is very different from my baby boom children, and I'm sure my little grandchildren, how they will use it will be very, very different again. And so we have to, and then there's also the socioeconomic gradient. So, cut long story short, there's a huge digital literacy piece, which is very specific about patients and has an equity lens as well, and very specific about this huge area of professional employment in this country or any country. And so we talk about STEM, it's just as much STEM as the other technologies we're talking about, but it's where digital literacy doesn't necessarily provide. And I think this is we don't yet, it's a bit like we were saying, we're using analogue methods in healthcare as well.
So I'm conscious that we've been having a fun conversation in front of a large number of people. So we're going to close with a couple of things. Your commentary around healthcare and the skills and literacy in professionals versus patients is an interesting one. So that actually goes to two curious questions that came up in our pre-panel conversation, one from Anne and one from Michael. We might do those and then we'll hand over to the crowd briefly. So over to you, Anne.
Well, I'll pitch it to Richard just because, which is, what is more challenging, developing the required digital literacy in your workforce or in your clientele?
They're both challenging in one sense, but interestingly, both of them have economic drivers that are very powerful. And so they have both been resolved very, very strongly. We've had a full digital training platform since 2012, and we've completely removed from services the delivery of training. We do it digitally, and we do it with partners around the world. And with our staff, we've had the WiseTech Academy for a number of years now, and again, we train those people, cross-train them, upskill them, retrain them, and so forth, relatively simply and at relatively low cost and at very high volume. I think we've trained to a certification level, because we're an RTO. We've trained something like 30,000 customers, and I think that's very encouraging for them because they get benefits because their certification gives them pay opportunities and employment opportunities. So interestingly, both of those run very well because there's economics sitting behind them that are very powerful.
So that's about the motivation of the people.
Money is an incredibly good motivator if it's placed in the right spot with the right explanation. It's a price signalling.
Michael?
Nudges.
Nudges.
Yeah.
Great book, by the way.
Yeah. So I guess we train a lot of top tech talent, and inevitably a lot of it just goes instantly overseas. And I guess the question to Mary and you would be, do you envisage a workforce where there is actually a large number of people who need very advanced tech skills, or do you see it persisting as what it currently is, which is a very small number of not particularly diverse people doing a lot of the key technology development?
I'm going to ask Mary to have a crack at that point first.
That one? Okay. I think if we get it right in Australia, and I think we've got the wherewithal to do that, it's actually a very large workforce with a whole lot of subspecialisations. I mean, just doing health tech, it is very specialised. You create a piece of tech, and then depending on exactly what it's doing, and the more AI it's got in it, the more you have to think about it as a medical device, as something that has to have randomised controlled trials and be authorised to be on some list of treatment. How you navigate, between the digital space, and that's just healthcare. I'm sure some educationists, school educationists, will be able to give similar examples. So I think we need a very specialised workforce. And I think it's one where, and it's sort of industry, where Australia could be, very good at it, and not assume that it's all going to be done in the Northern Hemisphere.
So we've come to the end of our time. We have one question that's come in online, and the question comes from Tom Carruthers. How do you see digital literacy in the workplace? Is the future organisations like Atlassian, or do we need a different model of work? We'll give everyone a moment to process that, and then Mary drew breath, so you get to go first.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the subtext of that is in terms of how that person asking a question would characterise Atlassian. But again, from my health experience, and I'm not a technologist, in healthcare, coming to it as a technologist, you, as I say, you try to come up with things, whether it was Microsoft's Health Vault that could be a electronic medical record for everybody, which of course just didn't gel into any ways healthcare worked, and that's just, I'm not picking on them. There's all these stories. So I actually think there's a whole focus for very diverse workplaces. So in creating Telstra Health and making that a successful enterprise involved just over half the staff are technologists across a wide range of fields, and the rest are people who are clinicians, people who've been responsible for delivering public or private healthcare systems. That's me, and others like me. It's people who have worked in healthcare to try and get up new policies or new models of care. How do you get a better stroke model? How do you get so that people, there are treatments that people can walk out of the hospital, having been brought in by ambulance, and have no harm, if provided you identify them and get the right thrombolytics into them in the right time window. And so we find with our customers is that when they come to talk to us, they're more interested now hearing about how we think about how they could change their model of care, and then how the technology backs that in.
Right.
But also, what does the technology allow you to do? And so, long story short, it's a very different kind of organisation, I think, probably from how Atlassian is organised.
Can I answer the Atlassian question? Because we've invested alongside Atlassian from...
10 seconds.
Sorry?
10 seconds.
Alongside. They're very hybridised. They're working from home a lot of the time. So is WiseTech. This doesn't really hurt a technology company because we don't have a direct customer interaction. But if you're in healthcare or you're a teacher, or you're doing anything with a patient or a customer, and you have to touch that relationship, you just can't do what Atlassian and WiseTech is doing.
Okay. Now we've had a series of questions come in, but Bina is about to drag us off the stage. Thank you very much. And as colleagues, as you can see, it's a collection of people with views with a capital V. Please join me in thanking our panellists today. They're an informed and engaged and interested bunch.